Hello and good morning, everyone. We'll begin the webinar here in just a few minutes. We're still seeing a few folks join and look forward to starting this webinar. We'll be with you shortly. Hi, everyone. We'll begin the presentation in about 1 minute. Thank you. Hello and welcome to our webinar, Salesforce Intelligent Continuous Testing for the Digital Enterprise. My name is Josh and I will be your host today. Today's presenters are Manish Mathuria, co-founder and COO of INFOSTRETCH, and Sai Niveda, product manager at TRICENTIS. Manish is an experienced technology consultant and business leader with a passion for building winning teams. In his position as Chief Operations Officer, he is responsible for global delivery, operations, and innovation. He has served as a senior technology consultant across quality engineering, software development, cloud, SaaS, and mobility for Fortune 500 firms and Silicon Valley startups. Sai is a product manager at TRICENTIS and has been in the testing industry for over 11 years. She has extensive experience in automation with a proven track record in implementing strategic testing solutions that help businesses overcome testing and process automation roadblocks. Her focus at TRICENTIS involves defining product strategy and designing innovative solutions to automate SaaS applications such as Salesforce, ServiceNow, Microsoft Dynamics 365, etc. Say hello, you guys.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you. And before we begin, let me review some housekeeping items. First, this webinar is being recorded and will be distributed via email to you, allowing you to share it with your internal teams or watch it again later. Second, your line is currently muted and will stay that way throughout the course of this webinar. Third, please feel free to submit any questions during the call by utilizing the chat function at the bottom of your screen. We will answer all questions toward the end of the presentation, and we will do our best to keep this webinar to the 45-minute to 1 hour time allotment. At this time, I will go ahead and turn over the presentation to Manish.
Thank you, Josh, and thank you, Sai, for joining me on this webinar. As the title suggests, today we'll be talking about intelligent continuous testing, particularly around Salesforce. So as part of the agenda, we will walk through why continuous testing and why test automation is so important for Salesforce. What are the pressing demands in the marketplace, some of the trends with which Salesforce has been evolving, particularly the challenges around classic to lightning transformation, and how best to describe all of this without a case study. So we'll talk about a specific case study that InfoStretch has been through among many of our customers. And finally, we will have Sai demonstrate how automation can be done with Tosca easily, intelligently, and leveraging the latest AI technologies. So let's get to it. A little bit about InfoStretch. InfoStretch is a digital engineering outsourcing company headquartered in Silicon Valley, California, with offices in New York, UK, and delivery centers out of India. We are about 1,200 engineers strong, and we enable our customers implement state-of-the-art next-generation digital solutions for their companies. I'll ask Sai to explain about TRICENTIS now.
Thank you, Manish. So TRICENTIS is the leader in continuous testing and automation. We have a presence worldwide and are at a lot of the top companies globally, as you can see on this slide. We work very closely with partners, including InfoStretch. One of the things that we help customers with is in the continuous testing space, basically supporting and accelerating their digital transformation journeys. Over to you, Manish.
Thank you, Sai. All right, so let's look at why test automation is so important with Salesforce. Test automation is a critical component in the end-to-end DevOps processes. As we all know, DevOps is another name for optimizing and automating your entire Salesforce, entire software development life cycle around Salesforce. So this means the act of development, building, deployment, and testing and ensuring quality through this entire process. Lots of studies, external studies, as well as our internal benchmarks while working with our customers have taught us that there is a significant ROI in implementing DevOps processes around Salesforce. Some of the numbers are explained here. For example, our customers have been able to achieve 46 times more deployments in the same time period using automated testing and automated DevOps processes, because it ensures that there is not that much human intervention in the end-to-end deployment process. There is less chance of failures. If you fail, there is a faster recovery time, again significantly higher, and you save as much as 40% reduction due to in the cycle times, in the deployment times, due to automated testing. So these all of these characteristics provide a significant ROI when you look at automating testing and other DevOps processes as part of your Salesforce software development lifecycle.
And Manish, this is also something that customers generally tend to struggle with implementing, right?
That is absolutely correct, Sai. In our experience, particularly around Salesforce, the implementers understand Salesforce very well, and they understand the process of implementing Salesforce and the business demands around it quite well, right? But when it actually comes to implementing DevOps practices, test automation, the teams struggle to do it correctly, right? So even though there is so much ROI and there's so much value, right, most customers struggle to actually do right amount of test automation around it, and hence get impacted in their release cycles.
Yeah.
Again, this slide talks a little bit further about the specific challenges teams face when taking Salesforce through the deployment cycles, right? Like I explained, DevOps cycles, automated DevOps cycles achieve end-to-end automation all the way through development, doing the build, deployment to various environments, and testing in that process, right? This achieves significantly high quality, time to market, right? Reduction in failure deployments, and significantly reduces mean time for recovery, right? We have seen that on an average, this increases cycle time at least about 50% in your end-to-end deployment cycles. Salesforce is...
Sorry, Manish.
Sure. I was just going to add, Salesforce is somewhat unique in the way DevOps processes get implemented. And that is one of the reasons, Sai, that you were mentioning, why it is so challenging to deploy DevOps practices around Salesforce. A, it is cloud. B, it is not your traditional custom software development environment, right? It's an environment in which there is a lot of customization, and there is a lot of pre-built packaged software that needs to be customized. And hence, right, it is extremely complicated to create an environment where a lot of this automation can be achieved via your traditional check-in and Git repositories and so on and so forth.
The other thing also is, given how easily customizable the platform is, the frequency of changes tends to be quite faster compared to the other applications in the space. So you can expect like higher turnaround with newer features coming in and deployments and things like that. So the frequency is something people need to watch out for.
Exactly. And in my experience, there are many causes of this high frequency, right? It is not just Salesforce deploying a new version on you, but your business processes change. Salesforce would often be not in an isolated world, but it would be amid various other enterprise applications across which these business processes are automated built, right? So any change in any of these applications could cause you to test and re-release and certify your Salesforce implementation. So all of these things actually combine together to actually make it a very sensitive testing process. Would you agree?
Yes, definitely.
Right. Let's move on. Now, when we talk to our customers and talk about, we often get asked, right, should we worry about automated testing, right? And is it for us, or can we do without it, right? And over the period while talking to various customers, we sort of kind of created these three categories of companies who are implementing Salesforce, right? For lack of better terminology, let's just call them small, medium, and large enterprise, right? See, here are some of the characteristics with which we recognize what is small, what is medium, and what is large. I think large and medium are somewhat more interesting here. So you would find that in a medium to large enterprise, there would be definitely a fair bit of configuration of Salesforce, but in addition, there would be a lot of custom code. And in addition, there may be integration, like I was explaining, with various other platforms across which various business processes are weaving in and out, right? There's a due to which there may be a high deployment frequency. The team sizes, by virtue of what you are building around it, could be complex and large number of developers, and hence the flux that creates between these developers through these testing and DevOps processes is very complicated, right? And therefore, right, you know, the time it takes for one to release a change to production, often without automation, can take from weeks to several weeks, and it is often a big impediment to, you know, progress of business, right? So we find that if you are a medium to a large enterprise, certainly automation can go a long way in achieving that higher cycle time, as much as reducing your cycle time by almost 50%. Any comments, I?
Just one thing around the medium enterprises. While it's mostly perceived that, you know, we can handle these things manually and stuff, so that's the general feel from some medium enterprises, at least, that it can be handled the way they're doing it currently, testing things manually and stuff like that. But actually, over time, the complexities of just the configuration tend to get pretty high. And that's when you're basically in that hypercare mode where actual end users are reporting issues back to you, and you're trying to perform these hot fixes in production. So the necessity to actually have that continuous testing in the space, especially from a medium enterprise onwards, is pretty important.
Agreed. Okay, moving on. So let's look at this from a case study perspective. I think it's best to explain the challenges that we typically run into across these medium to large enterprise customers via an example case study that we recently went through, right? I don't think this picture would be very complicated if you call yourself a medium to large enterprise. This particular customer was trying to automate and enable their sales, marketing, service delivery, and customer support business use cases through implementing Salesforce and a myriad of other products which form their entire enterprise stack. They are in a medical device. They are a medical device company, and therefore, you know, successful deployment and execution of these processes is critically important to their care provider customers and the patients and their patients, right? So as you can see, there are various products that come together to automate these processes that I talked about, and there is an integration technology underneath. In their case, it was Dell Boomi, but you know, we have seen MuleSoft, we have seen several others that get deployed in such scenarios, right?
Yep.
A little bit about the functional coverage they were trying to provide. Like I said, this spans across various business functions. I won't go into the specific use cases, but you know, needless to say that this huge range of functions that they are looking to automate around, particularly around Salesforce, is a multi-year, many developers kind of a project where, you know, from release 2, they realized that putting something to production without achieving automation and streamlining their processes, DevOps processes, was a incredibly complex task.
The other thing also, Manish, to add to this is depending on how the automation is set up, customers also tend to find that they're always playing catch up. So this is a very complex landscape, but actually keeping up with all of this from an automation perspective also proves to be quite challenging.
That is true, and you know, in the remaining part of the case study, I'll kind of touch upon that topic and talk specifically why it is so complex, right? This is a one of the moderately complex use cases that this customer had, right? As you can see, one of the complexity here is that one business use case actually spans across various various enterprise systems, and each of these systems have to be in the right state for that particular use case to successfully execute. This use case had in excess of 40 different test scenarios, right? And each of the test scenarios exploited a specific state or a specific nature of a work order, or whether the parts were internally manufactured or externally manufactured, and various other combinations of challenges, right? To touch upon why automation is complicated, right? As you can see, this is not just Salesforce, right? So if you are looking at identifying which product you are going to use, which test tool are you going to use in your testing stack, right? You have to keep in mind that it is not just Salesforce you are automating. So the product that you pick better support testing across these enterprise systems, right?
And the thing is also, what we're basically trying to do here is watch the journey of a piece of data from, say, a Salesforce across all of the systems that you have within the enterprise landscape. So that becomes important to track what is happening at any given stage of that data's journey.
Right, and speaking of data, right, that is yet another very interesting and very complex part in an end-to-end scenario like this, right? What we found before we got in was that before the customer could even think or talk about testing, right, they had to make sure that each of these systems were, with respect to data, were in the right state, right?
Yeah.
So along with actually doing automation or testing for them, we had to actually, cater to this data requirement. And again, the test tool that we chose, which we will talk about in a little bit, having an internal test data management system came significantly in handy, right? While we are on the subject of this use case, I also want to highlight another very important characteristic here. Often we found that these individual systems were not in the right state for us to test, and if we waited for each one of them to be exactly aligned with one another so that we could test this end-to-end system, right, we would be losing very important time that we could achieve while we could be testing one system. We used a concept called service virtualization, which essentially allowed us to simulate or mock another system while we were testing one particular system, right? So to give an example, right, when we assigned a work order to ServiceNow, that particular API call that actually assigned the work order to ServiceNow, we did not actually use ServiceNow until we really reached the end life cycle of testing it. On our all staging environment test, we were able to simulate all of this by leveraging a concept called service virtualization.
Yeah. So the importance of sort of testing in isolation and then testing together in your upper stages before the entire stack goes on to prod.
Exactly. So looking at some specific challenges around testing and release cycles, right? We already talked about the fact that 2-week release cycles are a norm these days, right? If you are doing anything beyond that, right, you are already significantly behind the market. Our advanced customers or mature customers actually can release to production multiple times a week in a fairly automated process, right? Um, and the release challenges are significant because this is a continuous and iterative enhancement and development environment, right? The test cycles, speaking of particular test cycles and testing landscape, right? Without automation, the regression testing can take days, right? And you will find that there is a lot of hidden or tribal knowledge across various teams in an organization. For example, certain use cases only business would know, or business is capable of executing end to end. So when you actually talk about end to end testing, you have to get on these giant conference calls and meetings, web meetings, where you are actually doing collaborative testing, which is literally wasting tens of hours from everybody, right? We talked about data conditioning problems, and we also talked about the need for the service virtualization and why it is important. So as we move along, let's look at specifically how we picked a particular tool, and I'll let Sai kind of talk about Tosca and its capability around Salesforce test automation.
Thanks, Manish. Let me just try and get my laptop started. So with Tosca addressing the challenges that we've got within the Salesforce space and the automation, basically touching upon a lot of things that Manish spoke about earlier. For the purpose of this webinar, we'll be focusing purely on Salesforce capabilities from an automation perspective. But we do have support for over 150 technologies, along with stateful data management, service virtualization, and things of that sort, for you to be able to test in isolation. But particularly within Salesforce, we have a no-code approach to automation. There's an interesting feature around this that I'll cover when we're doing the demo. Essentially to handle the dynamic nature and the hidden complexities within the Salesforce ecosystem when it comes to automation. We also have a couple of features that allows you to ensure that you get maximum coverage with the minimum number of test cases, so that you can actually have focused testing activities around the releases that are coming through. And just as an added benefit, the test cases that you create with Tosca will work on Classic and Lightning. So you don't need to make any changes if you're in the journey to transitioning from Classic to Lightning. All right. So I'll just jump into a bit of a demo. Before we look at what's actually happening on screen, for those of you unfamiliar with Tosca, just think about it as there are three things that you need to keep in mind when you are approaching automation, regardless of whether it's Salesforce or any other platform. You would be looking at what do you need to interact with. That's basically your elements on screen. And that's sort of where a lot of people spend some time. So while I'm walking through the demo, the first part that we're showing here is basically capturing the elements you need to interact with. And now this part, we've introduced a feature called the Salesforce scan. Let me key in my credentials here. And while I'm doing that, let me explain what this section, or the technical model section, does. This is basically telling any tool how it needs to, like, what does this element that I need to interact with look like. It's very easy for a user to look at it visually on screen, but explaining that to the tool in terms of how you're addressing this, say, XPaths, stuff like that, it does get a little too technical and sort of isolating the business in the process. So what you saw earlier was me basically keying in my credentials and picking the production environment, although it's not realistic within your own spaces. You would be using an upper sandbox, say maybe a UAT or an SIT sandbox. This essentially queries the metadata layer and fetches every single element that you can interact with within your Salesforce org. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Select All and Scan. Now you can see that there's a progress bar at the bottom that's basically querying your Salesforce instance. If you think about it, there's no two Salesforce instances that will look alike. So even the use case that Manish specified earlier is very specific to that customer. So you can't reuse everything that you have in that customer space within your environment because your business processes change. So what this has essentially done is picking the elements that are most relevant to you. The login module, the navigational elements, save buttons. So let's take a look at an account, for example. All of this is named according to what is there within the Salesforce organization, also roping in the administrators so they can understand what these layouts mean. Now, from a technical identification perspective, we've eliminated things that could change. So when Salesforce does change the UI, the labels of the elements are under your control. So I will just click through all of these elements so you can see that the only identification mechanism is an associated label, right? And also what this does is brings up all of your values that you can possibly select from a pick list, making your test case building that much easier. Okay, so now that you have the elements you need to interact with, it's about how you put this together in a test case to create a logical process flow before you can reach your verification goals within that space. So the process of assembling a test case is relatively simple in Tosca. Like we said earlier, no code approach. So I would just drag and drop these sections of elements onto the test case layout, put in my values. Now in this case, I'm navigating to the contact screen. So once we navigate to the contact screen, we need to click on new. So dragging and dropping the relevant module for that, renaming the test case so that it makes sense within that context. We spoke about isolated knowledge between the business and the automation teams, and the business not being able to contribute to automation, which in itself is sort of a disservice to organizations, right? So now that I've gone ahead and clicked on new, I will be entering some contact information on the field. Again, rename for it to make sense in the context, start entering your data. Now, in this case, we're using static data, but this is where some of the features that Manish spoke about earlier, things like test data management, things like test case design to optimize your workflow. There are tons of features that we can use, but we'll spare you for the purpose of this webinar. As you can see, it's relatively simple to start creating it, picking your action modes, what your verification points are, etc. So once you have your elements sorted and you've put your test case together, you can see that the same test case would work on Classic and Lightning. You can see Classic on the bottom left of the screen and Lightning on the top right of the screen. Keep in mind that there have been no changes made to the test case. So if you are on your journey transitioning from Classic to Lightning, your test cases are already done. Different user experiences, different UI, different technical information from a Salesforce perspective. Right, so Manish, could you walk us through a couple of your experiences with the platform?
Yeah, so Sai, it's an important point you're bringing up. We as a services company not just work with one product, right? We work with a lot of open source and several other tools in the marketplace. And we have what we have found is that when our engineers work with Tosca, we don't need a specialized skilled person. We have business analysts who are very well equipped to understand Salesforce and really are kind of very comfortable with Salesforce processes. They can pick up the tool and start to kind of automate test cases. So our ratio between our technical staff and the business aware staff changes significantly when we are working on Salesforce, particularly around Tosca, right? I consider that as a huge benefit because it allows us to be a lot responsive and execute much faster on our projects.
Yep.
I want to pick up here again, right? What we want to talk about also is around Tosca, what else is needed, right? So if you look at like an end-to-end stack, right? This is what we ended up implementing for the particular customer we are talking about. This, in fact, is a very typical stack that you will find in on pretty much all our projects, right? So we do the actual story grooming and identification of the stories, user stories through our sprint cycles in Jira. We bring those test cases into a test management system called TRICENTIS Q-Test. That is where we evolve these test cases and identify and map them to the user stories inside Jira. From there, we pick up these test cases and automate them through a process that is very similar to what Sai just described in Tosca. Here you can see that using Tosca all the way from test data aspects of it, virtualizing the services, making user interface tests, we also call them GUI tests, exploratory tests, API tests. We don't have to use various different technologies and tools. We use one tool to do all of these things from within that particular Tosca tool, right?
And that's also interesting, Manish, because the UI automation, especially within the Salesforce or the SaaS world, is what customers tend to struggle with the most, because it does take quite a while to stabilize what you need from a test suite perspective. So just in case the point was sort of missed during the demo, it takes you a couple of minutes to have your basic elements of UI automation ready for Salesforce. And you don't need to deal with going through it screen by screen and understanding what to pick, how to pick it, and how do I get a stable automation suite. So it sort of makes the process substantially faster.
The process side that you showed that was done automatically, which actually sucked the entire object structure, automation object structure, the GUI widgets that Salesforce had, on basis of which we will build the automation, right, in matter of seconds, is by industry standards and metrics, a test automation engineer spends about 40% of time maintaining, re-maintaining that, building that in automation code, right? So we can easily translate that to at least 40% saving in building of such test cases, right? All right, so some of the benefits that we would typically get on because of automation, right? And these are data points from this particular case studies, but you'll find very typical, very similar outcomes if automation were done right in your Salesforce project, right? You know, one of the critical metric that we track and we tracked for this particular customer was defect leakage to QA environments, right? So before UAT, where business folks actually do UAT in the QA environment, we were able to reduce defects by 70%. The regression test cycles we reduced from 2 weeks to 4 hours, right? We were able to, using this test data management, service virtualization, and various other technologies, we were able to automate scenarios which otherwise would not be automatable, right? We reduced significantly the test team size, because fundamentally, once the tests were automated with a small number of people, we were able to upkeep those tests. Of course, any automation requires maintenance, and instead of like executing a lot of tests manually and really doing this marathon web meetings to do test execution, right? You can actually spend that energy in just test maintenance, right? So those are some of the benefits that this organization got from test automation.
And one other thing also, when you do have these sort of distributed capabilities between a platform that's been picked, it gives you a little more flexibility to play with larger scopes, like things that would have traditionally been descoped, and there's suddenly ways in which you can achieve that and make sure your system is operating at the highest quality.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
A real quick slide on what InfoStretch brings out of the box. So it's not just that we know how to automate Salesforce. However, we also bring a fair number of pre-built assets that we can quickly put together. This could be test cases. This could be several components that are pre-created that we can actually deploy them towards your Salesforce automation, right? Um, we also bring best practices on what are the right kind of test cases to automate, what should not be automated, right? We have dashboards and metrics that we can quickly deploy and, put together a dashboard around either your Jira system or any other test management system as well.
Mhm.
Essentially, we can, very quickly start a project in matter of days, as opposed to sometimes it could take weeks for a team to, get started with automation.
The interesting thing here, Manish, also like having worked with your team quite closely, that ability to tell when you should, even within the automation space, when you should test something via the API versus UI. Now, that's something that a lot of people tend to struggle with. So bringing that knowledge on board has helped quite a bit. If you're doing this, do this with the API because this makes the most sense. Keep this to the exploratory level. So that's been a pretty good experience working with you guys.
Right, and it if you resort to testing everything through the user interface, that could lend your test cases brittle,
Yeah.
very time consuming and maintenance oriented, and actually lengthy to execute, right?
Yeah.
So absolutely making the right calls there can make a difference of night and day in your overall test execution strategy.
Yeah.
All right. So in the way of slides, this is what we had to present. We are open to Q&A. Josh, do you have any questions for the panel?
Yeah, thanks, guys, and appreciate your time. That was really interesting. So yes, as Manish mentioned, let's go ahead and open it up for questions. You can submit a question at any time using the chat feature there in Zoom. It's either at the top of your screen or the bottom, depending on where you have chat located. As a reminder, we can go ahead and submit a question anytime, and looks like we're getting a few in. I got one from earlier while Sai was talking, so I want to get that one started first. So for Sai, question came in about how can QA team members improve their understanding of Salesforce testing requirements?
That's actually a very interesting question, Josh, or whoever asked it, basically. There's a few things that you could do to help you get started. One is upping your domain knowledge, right? Understanding the domain that you're operating in and how you need to work with Salesforce and the nitty-gritties of Salesforce in general. Now, Salesforce has a great platform called Trailhead. It's a learning platform. It's free. You can start getting used to what the domain and the terminology around that space is. Now, also, given what we spoke about earlier in terms of the no-code approach and following terminology within the Salesforce space, bringing the business in to see how they're using Salesforce will help you understand how best to address the most risky areas for the business in general.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
And thank you for that. And Manish, we got one here for you. Someone asked, how do you determine what kinds of tests to automate in Salesforce? And also they're asking what tests to leave manual. That's good.
Yeah, I think that's a very important question, and I've seen teams sort of struggle with that. Particularly, this is very pertinent when it comes to a packaged application, right? You didn't write that application, so should you be testing what that application does, or should you be, or if not, then what should you be testing, right? So it's important to keep in mind that Salesforce is Salesforce. However, on top of that, you have built your business processes, you have kind of, interlaced that with your test data, and you have built this interesting kind of use cases that, for like an example that I showed on earlier slide. So, particularly in the case of packaged application, Salesforce not being an exception, keeping like an end-to-end business view in mind helps, as opposed to doing sort of more unit level tests, which test a particular module, because chances are that if you're testing a particular module, that would anyway be covered in an end-to-end test. So we focus on end-to-end tests. We try to prioritize them, of course, with the business priority and sensitivity to the impact that it would create on whatever function it's serving, revenue, cost, time, etc. Right? And finally, in that process, you will also discover things that are probably not very easily automatable. To give you an example, in the use case I described, there was the process got lost inside SAP for a while, and then it triggered the process to be restarted within Salesforce through an external trigger, and it was very complex for us to automate. We for certain reasons we had to automate it, so we actually did it. But we argued a fair bit that does it require to be automated? Can we test that particular piece manually? Right. So it's not a simple answer, but some of those are criteria.
Wow. Yeah. Very interesting. Thank you. Got one here, Sai, for you. Just came in. Someone says, my organization is planning a move from Salesforce Classic, I guess, to Lightning. What changes in testing should we prepare for? Interesting.
Just a couple of things. Now, based on the features we showed you, your base test cases that have been built can still be reused in Lightning. Of course, provided you've used a tool that supports both interfaces seamlessly. In this case, Tosca does have the exact same test case, having the ability to run on both modes of operation within Salesforce. Couple of things you need to keep in mind here. Fundamentally and functionally, there are a few differences between Classic and Lightning. Now, for example, you may need to do an extra step of navigation before you can get to a screen within Lightning, whereas you didn't have to do that in Classic. So these sorts of minor differences need to be kept in mind. So you may need to make some sort of tweaks, but these are generally more predictable. So you can preempt these changes and have them all in place. Other than that, a vast part of your test suite is absolutely reusable across both. Knowing what features and when these features are coming out from a Salesforce administrator perspective also becomes important. So be in touch with the team that's actually taking care of the migration, because they will have a report of the things that need to be done for a successful migration within Salesforce, as well as a roadmap for when these are going to be implemented. So your tests can actually be ready much before these changes come into your environments.
Okay, great.
One best practice we followed, is to we painstakingly keep our test cases very, very modular, right? So they are comprised of really these small functions that we can reuse across various tests, right? And the benefit of that is that, as you said, right, between Classic and Lightning, there could be one extra step, right? So if we have to really, create a different test in this parlance for Classic and Lightning, right, then it is just the rest of the test is still comprised of those various fundamental modules. There's this one small if statement that allows us to actually differentiate between the two, right? As opposed to
that's
really
very important.
Yeah.
Structurally, how test suites are maintained is very important, because it shouldn't be a matter of having to rewrite your test case. It should be a matter of either putting in a small conditional statement or a tiny little reusable step from somewhere. And the extent of which you can reuse test artifacts is super important in keeping up with the changes here.
Okay, thank you. Another question for Sai is someone's asking if you guys keep up with your Salesforce seasonal releases. I know Salesforce makes occasional updates to the software. So how fast do you update your site as well?
Just realized I should have probably covered that in the slides so far, but
that's
yes,
okay.
We are Salesforce release agnostic because we don't depend too much on the technical layers of each of these. We have our engine that takes care of that for you. In the event that there is a drastic change that Salesforce has introduced, especially to their UI layer, the maximum you would have to do is maybe install a tiny little patch, but you would not have to make any changes to your test suite. So we do keep up with Salesforce, the 3 releases Salesforce has a year.
A year, yeah, great, excellent. Okay. Looks like I have another one here for Manish. How frequently should the automated tests be run and in what environment?
Right. Uh, so what we do is we tag test cases with tags. So we basically, tag a test case to be apt for to be run as a build verification test, right? Or to be an end-to-end test, or maybe a priority one test, and so on and so forth, right? So that we can arbitrarily mix and match these tests to form these suites in Tosca that could be run appropriately for the right organization. So the right answer is that you would potentially be running different tests in different environments, right? After you do a build, your continuous testing system, your CI system will probably run a suite. That would be very different after you've done a deployment in maybe in a QA environment or in a staging environment, right? So this is done for purpose. The test selection is done for purpose, to which you are actually doing the test, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. Great. I do still have a bunch more questions, but unfortunately we are short on time. I want to make sure we get to them, and for those of you that have submitted your questions, we will respond to them via email. So please know that we have your questions, and we will get back to you shortly in the next couple of days or so. But I want to go ahead and thank our presenters. You guys did a great job. Thank you for participating. And many thanks to Manish and Sai. Thanks for everyone for joining today. You will receive an email in the next 24 hours with the slide presentation and the link to the webcast replay. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact us at info@infostretch.com, or you can reach one of the presenters and you see their emails here on the screen. And be sure to check out and subscribe to DTV, which is one of InfoStretch's digital transformation channels that we have that brings industry experts, including TRICENTIS and others, to market. Thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, and have a wonderful day.